it's a very arrogant claim to say that because we don't understand something, it has to be supernatural. No, it's a very humble claim to say we're just these little primates occupying a tiny little speck in a tiny little solar system in a tiny little galaxy in an infinite universe.
Hello and welcome to Holistic Circle Podcast, Spirit and Conversation. My name is Philipp Kobald. We are reaching out to people who are passionate about spreading light, love, and joy. And I'm happy to have here from cold Florida, Justin McSweeny. Hello, Justin.
Hi, Philip, and hello, audience. And yeah, it's a little, we were talking before you hit record. It's a little chilly here right now, which is not what you would typically imagine Florida to be like. But we do get little tastes of winter from time to time. This week is that instant. So
I wish I could turn the camera and show you how a bliss in Europe looks like.
I,
Fight the
yeah,
cold with the cold.
yeah. See, I'll never complain to anybody up north about how cold it is here because they'll look at me like I'm crazy. So, yeah,
All right. I'd love to.
that's a balmy day for us. So anyway, sorry.
I love to start the podcast to give my guests a small minute to introduce themselves to people better understand what they do, what they're from, what motivates them, what moves them, and we'll take it from there. So I'll time a minute and a half for you.
Okay, that should be enough time because there's not a lot to tell, but yes, to the audience, like Philip, I call it an interview series, but it is ostensibly it's a podcast, and it started about 4 years ago, or I started about 4 well, we both started about 4 years ago. My drive and interest in doing the show was to explore, much like you, some critical ideas and thoughts that confront every person on this planet and find that universality and just set up an endless string of inquiry or series of inquiries with each of my guests. There's no specific theme necessarily, but I have a tagline that I like to explore sense, meaning, and purpose, and in various perspectives of sense meaning. So there's sense making, meaning making, purpose making, discovery of sense and purpose and meaning, and all these different ways of approaching that. So that's the gist of what I do. And my life beyond that is probably very trivial and not a whole lot. I love botany and horticulture. And one of the key drivers behind my show is philosophy. And I do absolutely adore philosophy because it helps settle my existential angst a little bit, and I don't have a lot, but if I do get deeply concerned about the state of humanity, then I go into philosophy and I just try to understand who we are and what we're doing. And that's also enriched by the guests that I have on because I've had some absolutely amazing people. And I know you'll probably have a link for the audience if they want to discover the show, see some of the guests that I've had. And I'll say that I don't draw any revenue from it. So this is not a shill for, me making money or anything. It's I call it a hobby, but it's, could be called a public service perhaps. Yeah. So anyway, so that's me. That's what I do.
Wonderful. Just small correction. I'm doing it since last October. So no 4 years on my back.
No, I'm talking my show was 4 years.
Yeah, I know. So that's
Oh.
so you're the senior podcaster and I am the junior
Oh,
junior
okay,
pod.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's not about the time. If your heart's in it and you're getting good guests and you have good conversations, then yeah, I could have been a mediocre and I don't consider myself a good host. I do my best to, help make a good conversation with whomever it is I have. And like I said, I've had some what I consider high caliber people in terms of what they've done academically or intellectually or whatever it is their field that they're respected in their field. So I try to, humble myself and say, "Man, you've got somebody important coming on." And I don't even like saying that they're important, but they do important things, and so I try to scare myself into being a competent person that shows up to ask questions.
So that's a
Uh,
bit the difference between my podcast and yours. You're much more science orientated and more information driven and knowledge driven, while I focus a bit more on maybe on the person and you could say the trivial, but I don't see it that way. I just see the human connection, which is more my focus. So I guess we all have our little corner and we all try to see the world as best as we can from our perspective. But of course, there is a link with about spirituality because you said a lot of your work knowledge and a lot of philosophy, and that leads, of course, of big life questions. And also how science is improving and giving us a lot of knowledge. And we will definitely come to that part a bit later. But I would love to invite you or engage with you in a conversation that's been really going through my head. The last, basically, I started, as I said, last October. And the years before, I've been in the spiritual world. I've been a teacher for many times and all of it. And I consider myself very lucky. But looking back in the last 20 years of my life, if I had one, two, three good, deep spiritual conversations a year, I would have considered this to be a very lucky year, right?
Mhm.
To meet someone, you link and really then talk whole night long with a bottle of wine about the big metaphysics and stuff. It's a rare thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And since I have this podcast, I'd say I have conversations like this once or twice a week.
Mm,
So
mm.
and you said you've done it for 4 years. So I would just like to start to see how did it affect you? Did you learn? Did you transcend? Did you grow? How is basically, I don't recommend everybody as a spiritual journey open your podcast, but seeking conversation that's why let's start it from there. If you want to say a couple of words, what inspired you, transformed you, how did you grow? What means podcasting for you? Did it make you a better person?
Right, right. I would along the lines of that question, I would say that I'll start with an instance of what I take away from my engagement with these persons that come on my show. And one of the guys I interviewed is a cognitive science. His name is John Vervaeke. Some of you may have heard of him. He's sort of a public figure in his little corner of the internet. And he has, and it's not his term, but he calls it dialogos. So you and I are dialoguing right now. We're in a conversation. And if we start engaging in a matter related, let's say, to spirituality, which seems to be a recurring theme in your show, that we are in a dialectic at that point. We are exchanging ideas and building up a framework for the idea of spirituality in a dialogue. And so we're exchanging ideas and we're enriching our understanding mutually in this exploration of any subject, but we'll talk, about spirituality as it relates to your show. And we'll get into a flow state in that conversation, and that's when the dialogos opens up. And it's a Neoplatonic idea that you're entering into, and dialogue is, as you can imagine, phonetically is similar to dialogos, but it's more of an expanded dialogue. So that again, as you said in your in asking me the question, that you engage in this deeply enriching, deeply informative, mutually transformative reciprocity, all this beautiful stuff unfolding in just a conversation and just two people exploring ideas and information together on whatever subject. It could be gardening, but it's again, as we're discussing it, spirituality. So that has been an amazing takeaway for me when the camera comes on and I engage somebody on my show, and we'll break the ice a little bit, we'll start talking, and then we'll just sort of, without even noticing, we'll feel the unfolding. We'll feel the mutual connection and the mutual expansion of a space, a thought space or an idea space. And that the flow of the conversation is palpable. And that, there can be good tension in that we challenge each other's thoughts. Well, what do you mean by this? And where are you, what are you conceiving of when you're talking about this? But it's never adversarial. It's always meant that the idea, in this case, spirituality, is being held in high regard and it is being respected. And there is reverence to this idea that we're discussing. And that we're, and some would call this a loving exchange between two people. So, like you said, you sit down with a glass of wine with somebody and you're in a space with them, and when you open up an idea space, then there is, again, very lightly an intimacy that is developed there that allows you to be a little more vulnerable and a little more curious and a little less defensive about things that you hold to be true, and that you will be willing to listen to the other person. So anyway, to get to a point that has been something I've experienced with quite a few of my guests, and that to me is to speak of spirituality, is a very sacred moment when you can do that, and you walk away from that conversation, or you revisit the conversation through the recording, and you say, "Wow, that was really neat. That was really incredible." And intellectually, you prepare yourself for the conversation by studying the work of that person, or reading papers they have in the literature, or watching other interviews that they've done. so that you show up, you know, forearmed with a little bit of knowledge, but excuse me, about what they do or who they are. Get me. And yeah, so
This is where you and me have the huge difference. I try to know as little as technically possible about my
mm,
guest
mhm,
because I really want to connect with them. I'm not less information driven and knowledge driven. You have to prepare because you
mhm,
want to really develop your audience, huge knowledge that they're part of a very high quality intellectual conversation. Well, I want them to meet the person.
yeah,
And so the more fresh I meet the person, the more authentic the meeting happens. And that's what I aim for. But
yeah,
the question I actually wanted to ask you on what you've said, I'm an old guy and I'm very new to the internet world in that sense. I've treated
mhm,
hundreds of patients with my hands, and taught so many meditation classes and workshops. But it's always live and hands-on. So I'm very fascinated right now by the fact that people do all kind of spiritual healing, psychic stuff, all kind of energy transmission, not live in the room, but through the medium of internet. It
mhm.
becomes a fascinating. What are your thoughts between the glass of wine and the live conversation and energy in the room and the internet? Do you think it's equal valuable, or how does it all work for you?
I think that there are some limitations when we are in this sort of simulated environment where you and I are looking at each other through a screen and a silicon plastic, contraption that nonetheless conveys our images, it conveys our sound. So I think even though we're in this proxy state, I think that it's still possible to build a connection because what's happening in both scenarios, both the in person in the same room together and you and I thousands of kilometers apart, is that the information space is open and the space of what we could say is intentionality or what we are engaging with, the aboutness of what we're dealing with is still present. So I would say it's just an added bonus to be in the same room with somebody because like you said, there are a lot of micro cues, physical gestures and facial expressions that are nuanced that we could pick up on. There is also the vulnerability of being in a physical space with somebody. Somebody I interviewed once gave a great definition of love, and they said it is making oneself vulnerable to know more, to open up, and to learn and to be connected with that person. So that's just a species of the definition of love. There's obviously all types of different types of love, but that I like that idea that you are opening up a space where you're putting your guard down and you're saying, "Hey, listen, I want to engage in this mutually, again, reciprocal or unfolding with you. And that, and it's about an idea. It's not that, two people are getting together and falling in love with each other. It's more that they're loving that idea and thoughts and the exchange that's going on. And that could relate to, like you said, doing an energy healing thing or whatever you were there for. Because then you still, again, you have to make yourself vulnerable to say, this person's going to enter into my space. They're going to be engaging with me. And that can be, challenging for some people, so
When I've noticed, I talked to several therapists and a couple of clairvoyant people, and I've noticed that the therapists after Corona now little bit leaving, little bit slowly the online consultation
mm,
world and coming back and thinking it's more effective, or it's just the right proper way to sit in front of the client. And as you said, seeing micro movements, seeing body tension, seeing all of these things. So I've had a couple of therapists who slowly drifting out from the online consultation by clairvoyance. Almost definitely they've been there, they've gone there, and they say it makes no difference for them whether the energies they're working and seeing, they're universal and they could be on the moon. It would make not the slightest difference. That's what I've learned so far. And that brings me to my next question, because to the what fascinated me, for example, I was never a big angel guy, right? I'm no problem with the idea. It's just all right, whatever, honestly. And now I have several very deep interviews with people who work with angels, see angels, and I've encountered a lot of similarities of wisdom, and I've encountered a couple of discrepancies of wisdom. So I found it very interesting. So I have now, this is proud my 30th interview. So I'm far behind you,
Mm.
far behind you. But I've seen that patterns emerge. Now, this is my question to you. Patterns of knowledge, patterns of information and odd differences. How does this come with you with all your interviews? Have you learned some universal truths that always reappear? Have you become more obsessed with the small differences, or do you focus on the similarities? How does this has affected you?
As I stated earlier when I was introducing myself, one of the things I like to explore is sense making. And in sense making, there are levels of abstraction that are necessary when we sense make. So the first order of sense making would be sense data arriving to this living system. I'll use myself as an example, but any living system is onboarding sense data from the environment. We have to then, at another order of abstraction away from that, have to process that sense data, which is sense making. So that's an order of sense making. What is going on in my environment? Who am I engaged with or what am I engaged with? What's going on? Is it, something good for me? Is it something bad for me? Very primitive type of scenario. Then there's a third order of abstraction wherein we as humans, as metacognitive, self-reflective agents, these persons in the world that as far as we know beyond a handful of other species are capable of these deep insightful thoughts that we can talk about things like angels or energy or things that make no have no purpose for just everyday utilitarian getting by survival, all this other stuff, and that we have that capacity to think in this manner. And what I would call maybe a third level of abstraction of sense making, is that we use these ideas in that space, and I'll use angels as an example. Whether or not angels exist, I don't care. There's a term called agnostic. It's you can't know. There's agnostic to say I don't know, but agnostic means I can't know. I can't produce an angel for you. But what I can do is use an angel as a sort of algorithmic sense making virtual machine or psychotechnology or whatever fancy word you want. Is that is my way of doing a complex sense making um, operation. So I'll say that, my angels are guiding me, or I feel as though there is an angel, protecting me, or whatever. So but if you want to get sort of cynical for a moment, you could say, well, that person is just using this X variable, this unknown thing going on, to sense make for themselves what is going on. Now, again, in my agnosticism, in my ignorance, there could well be something going on that's beyond our sense our lower level sense making grasp, the basic senses, the smell, the touch, the hearing, and all this. Something going on that we don't have access to that could be informational. It could be an aspect of ourselves that we're not necessarily in contact with, and I'm not really referring to the subconscious, but there could be whatever, and that manifests itself as an idea or an image of an angel assisting you. So I'm offering kind of a skeptical way of looking at it, but nonetheless, who knows what's going on. But so anyway, that if that's an answer, and it's kind of long winded, is to say that when we speak of these things that are deeply abstracted and ostensibly inaccessible to us, except, like you said, in anecdote. You have several people reporting to you, and you see this in psychedelic use, that people report repeatability in anecdotes. And there's a guy named Ray Wolfram, and he has a very good quote that fits for this, and it says the plural of anecdote is data. So normally empiricists want data, people doing hard science, they want empirical data, but anecdotal data is considered to be spurious because it's just a person reporting. But if you get consistency over time, as you stated, that you'd spoken to several people who claim to, interact with an angelic this or that you could consider that to be something you can work with. And I'm not saying it's reifying or instantiating beyond a doubt that there are angels out there. It's just know that these people are using a similar pattern to complete processes of sense making. So I know it's
I
not
thank
it's
you
not a it's not a wonderful, like, romantic answer, but it's another way to see your sense-making process with
for
particular instance.
thank you for bringing me to that answer. I will rephrase my question. Was probably I said it wrong, but let's first stay a moment with angels, and if we're anyway there, before we go back to what I wanted to actually ask you. It was a bit different, but I must probably made it wrong. Uh, about angels, I think is so interesting because now I looked into it and I figure out that basically almost every culture since the beginning of time, very clear definition of people working and talking with angels exists. That in every religious background, in every native society, we have angels. And yeah, what fascinated me was that I interviewed now 6 or 7 people from different countries, different academic or non background, clairvoyant, not so very different people. And when they described their interaction with the angels, and that one woman yesterday said that she's 3, 4, 5 times a day talking to angels, and then they
Mhm,
go into specifics, how they appear, how they communicate, and
mhm.
such as interesting that how the room temperature is changing. Maybe they all could basically steal information from each other. Could be possible, but I found it quite fascinating that through this talking to so many different people, an empirical level emerges. And that was actually my question. I was not about angels, about this fact that you're talking to so many different people, never mind what's the subject, but patterns emerge in the chaos. And I wanted to know from you, from all this information, if there are interesting patterns emerge with your guests, referring to the same wisdom, or if you have come something like I have started to think about angels because everybody's talking about them and interesting, I must think about it. So I wanted to know if you have a similar experience that in the chaos patterns emerge.
Well, so I'll answer it a couple different ways. First of all, I'll what I s all that talking I did a moment ago was kind of formalizing what you just asked, is to say
Uh-huh.
that there is a process going on there. Now, I'll freeze that for a second, and I'll go to the last part of the question that you just had. In my idea exploration with my guest, it's not I typically don't address things that some folks might call supernatural or something beyond a veil. I address far more tedious and mundane issues of psychology, cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and other types of philosophy like metaphysics, which is a philosophical, and also epistemology, axiology. There's, epistemological thinking is like knowing and trying to know something. So in that it's again, not putting demands or pressures on someone to have it's more accessible and it's more available. So I'm not asking somebody to say, "Well, what is an angel?" or define it. We have stuff that's pretty palatable and pretty easy to access with the work that I've done or with the people that I've engaged with. So it's far more universal. So again, if you come up to a hard-headed skeptic, it's like, "Oh, there's no such thing." We'll go back to angels for a second. There's no such thing as angels, and I can, it it's more like, well, what we're seeing in neuroscience right now states that, blah, blah, blah. And so I'm not it's
All
not
right,
as much of a,
that's
a
fine.
labor to right. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to me because all of that speaks to an underlying mechanism or system of machinery that generates the mind that can
Yes,
then again, as I said, these orders of abstraction of
yes.
sense making.
I have another one that
Yeah.
with I was not aware of. I was really also another one is trauma. Super popular. It's obviously the hit of the hour.
Yeah, yeah.
You talk
Mhm.
with so many different people, and they all squeeze in the word trauma. It's almost like
Yeah.
a buzzword. If I don't have a podcast with somewhere pumping up to some signs, they have a sign basically down there, and in some moment like trauma, and podcast can continue. So it's interesting because it was not there 15 years ago. Hardly anyone would talk about trauma, and now it's oh basically Reiki is living the building. So there are patterns that emerge. And I think it's an interesting part for me as a young podcaster, talking to such different people, such different backgrounds, that ultimately patterns emerge because all
Mhm.
have their favorite subjects, but then they're relinking and they're relinking, and it has an effect on me. It clearly has an effect on me. If you hear 5 times a day trauma, well, it has an effect. It, it clearly does not leave you empty handed or other subjects that emerge. So this was just a simple, curious question if the same
Yeah.
influence is happening to you as it does to me. But let's keep it on that. Now, and the next big thing is, because that's definitely more your wheelhouse, I had now a couple of people mentioning that science is catching up with the supernatural on many different levels of quantum medicine, or there's so many different places, new research about meditation and things like that. Where do you stand? What is, I'm sure that's definitely your wheelhouse. How is science catching up with spirituality? Is there something that you want to say about that?
Well, I hope I don't make the audience cringe or you. I don't want you to cringe as my as my host, but I I take a very heterodox view on the supernatural. And if it can be experienced, thought of, interacted with, engaged with, even abstractly, that it's not there is no supernatural. It's natural. It's happening. It's just it's a very arrogant claim to say that because we don't understand something, it has to be supernatural. No, it's a very humble claim to say we're just these little primates occupying a tiny little speck in a tiny little solar system in a tiny little galaxy in an infinite universe that may be a bubble universe of many. So I'm just trying to humble myself when I say this, that if it appears to be supernatural, we can use it as a casual term and say, well, because I don't have direct access to it, it must be beyond my natural capacity. I mean, that might be a little more tempered way to say it. So, and again, I'm not trying to, poo poo anything or say that, there's no such thing as, because again, I'm an agnostic. I don't know, but what I would say, what I would suggest as food for thought is to say, if you think something is supernatural, if something is so transcendent that we can never have, it's in another world, it's in another dimension or whatever, that it's still within a natural framework. It's still part of the universe. It is still part of what occurs. Because when you really think about supernatural, it implies that it's in some other inaccessible domain and that there's this impermeable membrane that keeps us from that dimension or whatever you want to call it. So I would say, for the sake of sense making again, that we just call it something that's obfuscated from us, that it is not directly accessible to us. And there are probably, for instances, that would be easy to make examples of, but I won't belabor that, because to get to the next part of your question about science and spirituality, I would say
Uh,
that the two
uh,
should. Yeah,
uh,
go ahead.
I'm not sure if I used the word spirituality wisely. Maybe it was my mistake. Let's talk about quantum medicine. Let's talk about
Right.
meditation.
Yeah.
And
You know, we can put all that together. What I would say, and this is just me, so you can dismiss me if you want. And I'm talking to you, Philip, but just anybody in the audience, if you react to this, I don't think the two should be mixed. I think science has a huge job to do to figure out what our next technological advancement's going to be, what can we understand about the core nature of how the universe unfolds and expresses itself, what chemistry is going to do for us in the future, what the social sciences or the soft sciences are going to do for us in the future. But I think one of the last charges that science should undertake is to solve our spiritual questions. I think what can happen with science is it can guardrail our spiritual practices so that we don't get too far off the rails and start coming up with some really crazy, nonsensical, or even conspiratorial ideas that are deeply inconsonant with, or in a cognitive dissonance with what science is offering us. Because I'm sure you'll notice that some people will say, well, mainstream science, it's not, lining up with, what we're seeing over here with, again, things like the quantum. Nobody really has a firm grasp on the quantum. There are some really good ideas. There's theories out there. There's loop quantum gravity, there's Bayesian quantum. There's all these different ideas getting kicked around, but until we can really formalize it and really come up with something, some other, Stephen Hawking type person comes along and cracks something, that we have to be very epistemically humble about what's going on at the very fabric of our reality. But that leaves us lots of room to play spiritually. I think that we can have our cake and eat it too, where we don't have to rely on the, you see, physics is reifying this for me. It's telling me that my spiritual beliefs are true. First of all, let's not think of spirituality as true and false or verifiable or something that we have to get confirmation from science. Spirituality, to me, and I hope I'm not going on too much of a soapbox tangent here, is it's a deeply personal experience. It's a shared experience, as you said earlier, with the angel encounters. It's a deeply personal, but nonetheless communal experience. It's something that we all engage with. And as you said a moment ago as well, It's been with us since we've been humans. And so to go back to what I hope is the spirit of your question, that we can use science in informing us about our spiritual practices, but using sciency claims and sciency ideas like I'm going to drink this quantum elixir and I'm going to activate, some kind of new expression of my consciousness. I would caution that. I would deeply caution that because I hold spirituality to be in its own domain, its own sacred nature, whatever you want that to be, that it doesn't require science. You don't need to validate it through an equation, And so I could be pissing some people off in saying that, but I think if we're going to enter into a spiritual practice, we don't need science's permission, and we don't need to look to quantum physics to give us evidence that we're on the right path. I think spirituality has to be vague and ambiguous and unknown. That's what I love about the term agnostic. I don't know, but okay. If you'll grant me another minute, and then I'll hand it back to you. There's something called apophasis in Christian in theology. It was specifically Christian theology. Apophasis and cataphasis are opposed to each other, but they're in a tension that works with each other. And an apophatic practitioner will say, I don't know what I'm engaged with, but I know when I'm in the presence of the divine or the sacred. They don't have the audacity to define what they're doing. They just know that when they're engaged with something, they feel it, they experience it, and they don't give a crap what anybody thinks about it. But the cataphatic theologian will say, no, God is this. God is anthropomorphic. God is bipolar because he gets really mad sometimes, and he's a he, and I know exactly what God is. So so I would err on the side of apophatic, so that there's a lot more space to be impressed upon by whatever it is that you're engaging with, rather than confining this idea of the sacred down to some very human-like, very fallible traits. So again, I'm being very heterodox here, but and you can do a balance of the 2. You can have moments where you're in cataphasis and you say, "My gosh, the universe is doing X," and then you can other times where you're in the mystery and you say, "I have no idea what's going on, but I'm in this really beautiful space and I feel so much love in my heart," or whatever, or I'm, opening up to something. So anyway, I'll stop there because like I said, I to summarize, I think science and spirituality can dance with each other. There can be some overlap, but that if you're using sciencey jargon to nail down what you think you're doing spiritually, I'd say think about that and re-examine that maybe and see or I don't know. I'm not trying to be too prescriptive here, but for me it's not the right way to approach it.
This is such a rare treat you've been giving me. It's unbelievable. It's
Oh,
because you always see those things on television, but it's the first time I'm live when somebody has the best and kindest intention of saying something, and I know that the audience will get every word wrong. And it's 100% that a big part of the spiritual community is gonna blow their head,
mm,
although you actually meant it full of love and kindness. And I absolutely understand what you mean. And I know that a lot of people want to get it wrong, and there's no curing for it. So this
yeah.
was a wonderful moment for me of being part, something like that. it's love is a hard, a hard thing
Well,
to share.
here's the good news, Philip. You can keep doing all of your practices, even if you're a not quite an evangelical Christian, but if you're a practicing Christian, anything I just said should be inspiring. Or if you're a new age holistic
So,
practitioner healing,
so to,
it shouldn't destroy your world. In fact, it should reinforce it. If you're
no,
if you're clinging on okay, one more tangent. If you're clinging on to ideas so tightly that again, I'll use evangelical Christianity. They have every letter and punctuation mark of the Bible has to be 100% true and correct, or everything falls apart for them. It's called a false dilemma. They construct a belief system around a book of didacts and parables and allegory and all these things, and they reify it into something that is absolute in its truth and its content. It's divine. It is unerring. Yada yada yada. And so that's a kind of dogma that you can detach yourself from and say, well, what's going on here? What are the psychological drivers for you to reify these things so tightly? So I would offer that. It's just a challenge. It's not to tear apart what you believe in. It's just that you reapproach what you believe in with a little more reverence and a little more awe and mystery. None of us have this crap figured out. Me, chief among them. I don't know a damn thing when it comes to spirituality. I just know what my spiritual practice is. And I'm happy to share that with anybody. But like I said, I'm offering utilities and tools and ideas to question some of your approach to a spiritual practice that can help you improve your relationship with whatever it is you think you're engaging with. That's all it's meant to do. So if people's heads are popping right now, that's fine because maybe that's a push to think about it. And I'm not trying to replace anything either. I'm not offering, well, this is my opinion about, what this is what you really should be doing. No, never. That'll never come from my mouth. So it's just question what you're doing with love and with the intention of improving it, not destroying it, not throwing it away, not, making it false. There's no true or false to this.
Uh,
That's why we get in trouble with science because science wants truth. Spirituality doesn't is
Justin,
not a
uh,
yes.
give me 1 microsecond. I will make a mini pause because maybe my wife is at the door without a key.
Yeah,
So
okay.
I will just I
Okay.
I let it run. It will just take a microsecond.
Okay. And then if the audience, if you're still here and you're still listening, again, that's whole intention of this practice is to take things apart so that you can see the constituency of what you're doing. And again, if anybody's while Philip's away, think about Buddhism for a moment, and what Buddhism asks you to do in understanding a self, no self relationship and understanding the dukkha and all these other ideas, it's there. It's already in all the wisdom text. I was just saying to the audience that, it's okay. If somebody got triggered by this, and I invoke Buddhism because when we talk about Buddhism, the Buddha invites us to explore the idea of a no self and experience what dukkha is when you become attached to things too hard. So the Buddha Bodhisattva himself, and I'm not a Buddhist, but these are examples of wisdom teaching. And Christ taught a lot of ideas of kenosis where you empty yourself out and you become a no thing or a nobody long enough a no and I could get into a huge tangent about selving an identity that would probably drive your audience insane but I'll stop now that you're back and see what where you want to go.
Well, no, please drive my audience insane. That sounds like a good
I do it
idea.
with love because I want people to have a healthy spiritual relationship or a relationship with reality is more what I would call it.
No, this was thank you. Sorry, but
No, no problem.
sometimes people forget their keys. But we came basically more than halfway through the podcast. We had all the crazy questions I can give you. Maybe you can also, because you're a more than accomplished podcaster, just bring me a couple of questions I didn't come up on my own to see your things that you've heard that you want to maybe a little bit share. My audience is different than yours, but food for thought, just maybe engage some ideas that pop into your head about spiritual seekers, and you said that you are totally into knowledge and learning or
Hmm.
understanding or making sense of knowledge, knowledgeable approach. And you know that the main part of spirituality by the end of the day is learning. That's the key, right? It's growth learning, inside, outside, through practice, for thinking, no matter what. That's what we do. We open us up to wisdom. And I think this is where you and me must probably bond the most because that's what you do. You're opening up yourself to wisdom and you seek wisdom, whatever wisdom it is. So let's spend a minute and I'd be happy to hear whatever pops into your mind by the idea of opening ourselves up to wisdom.
I like that. Thank you, Philip. And it can stay on the same path that tangent I was on earlier. And I'll share with the audience, I'm not a wise person. I don't consider myself to be no knowledgeable, but what I want to share is something I've done personally that seems to help me. And I just showed some of the cards in my hand a moment ago when I was talking about apophasis, about having a kind of negative spirituality. And I don't mean negative in a cynical way. It's negative that it's an extractive process rather than an additive process, so that you're taking things apart or you're deconstructing things so that you see um, a parts relation, but nonetheless, it doesn't affect the value of the sum of those parts as a totality, as a singularity. And that sounds weird, but what I would suggest is that when we talk about self is and identity of a person, this goes again to what I was just saying about Buddhism. Exercise that you can do spiritually is to contemplate uh, the idea that selfing is not concrete, that the identity of a person is not concrete, that the self is a process. It is a series of like frames in a movie the old-fashioned films when it would go frame by frame past the light. That's kind of what selfing is. That's what being itself is because the self is not static. The self is constantly learning and updating and onboarding new information, which is again sense making. And from that, we derive meaning. We derive meaning in our lives, and meaning can be good or bad. We can have, that is in our best interest that may have negative valence or negative affective states arise from what we think something means. And so in healthy sense making, we can do better meaning making. And part of that again is knowing how to carry the self or the apprehension of a self, how we view ourselves to be and what our identity is. And there's people in social systems theories and media studies that talk about these things about what identity is and what self is. And again, it goes, it has its roots in Buddhism. There are neuroscientists that talk about the self is a hallucination or an illusion, which is just clickbait, but it's partially true that again, you cannot point to a locus of a self. You cannot point to an absolute selfness. There is a being, there is a physical being there. But I would say that the self is constituted of a very dynamic process. And that is something to explore. I can't unpack a lot of that here in this conversation. But when we self make, when we selve the being, that there's a lot of latitude that can be had and afforded in the expression of that self. And we tend to lock into what we think is a solid identity and a solid egoic persona, all these kind of things, especially when we're engaged with others, because we do show up in social situations as a particular species of ourself, a particular expression of ourself. And when we are in solitude, we may be another expression of ourself. So I would invite the audience to consider that as a practice, a spiritual practice, because it will only help you to navigate how we selve through space and time, how we selve through experience. And if we can do that apophatic process of sort of deconstructing beliefs and apprehension of what we think reality is or what we think the world at large is and the persons in our lives are, and have more of an again an agnostic approach to that and just say, well, I can hold an idea to be true, but I want it to be flexible so that if something else comes along and helps inform me about that idea, that I can update that. And that's that Bayesian calculus. It's to update your priors and believe that, you are a learning system and you're constantly updating and upgrading yourself. That can go a long way to enriching a spiritual practice because for me, I have a very subtle and very boring spiritual practice. It is that I choose or wish to engage with my fellow persons, my fellow humans in this world in a compassionate manner, in a manner in which I am trying to show up without uh, uh, biases or prejudices or ideas about what I think somebody or something is or an idea is, and just be open to the exchange. I will bring my ideas to that and exchange them, but like I have been in this conversation, and again, nothing I say I'm deeply attached. There's no deep attachment to it. They're just ideas to consider, and it's kind of a meta practice to explore what I'm engaging with.
Brings me almost to my last question because I liked a lot when you said in your introduction and also in our meet and greet, almost like community service. Then you
Mm.
described your podcast. This is now the second time you said it. And of course, I love it a lot. And I now putting your words to you as a question, almost like community service. Please define how you think, how you want to help the world develop your motivation to how do you see your role, your role, and then maybe also the role as a podcaster with community, define community service as a podcaster, as you as a person, if you may.
I see the tangible, accessible product that has been produced by way of this interview series that I've created on Spotify and YouTube. as being a virtual machine, set of psychotechnologies, which is just information that we apprehend, to offer ideas and thoughts for people to update their priors, to change a perspective. It's not changing beliefs necessarily. In fact, I would ask people to have hold belief very lightly and don't lock it down. Don't chain yourself to a particular vector pointing in information space and in knowledge space. Be open, be fluid, and be willing to change. And again, I'm throwing out a lot of ideas and information, but again, I'm not wedded to them. They're always available for malleability and transformation. And that is the community services I want to offer, is to say, to put one word to it, it is a form of skepticism. It is a But I'm not talking modern cynical skepticism. I'm talking the ancient Greek definition of skepticism, specifically something called Pyrrhonian skepticism, which is to say their tagline was epoche leads to ataraxia, that a suspension of judgment leads to a state of well-being. And that was Pyro of Elis, and he co-opted that from the Gymnosophists, who were proto-Buddhists, who were doing what the Buddha was teaching. And but he brought it to Greece, ran it through a Grecian lens, and said, epoche leads to ataraxia. I think that is enough to, as a platform, to begin a spiritual journey or restart a spiritual journey. Is today, if you suspend judgment, you will have a state of well-being. In other words, if you don't hold too deeply to anything dogmatic or any hard, firm, and fast beliefs about anything, that it allows you that fluidity and that flexibility to navigate information space and physical reality with less friction and less tension. And that if you can do that and still be you, still be your egoic self, still be the thing that you identify with every morning when you wake up, but just recognize that that is a transformable process, that the self that you are is, you're not the person you were at 10, you're not the person you were at 20, you're not any person that you were until the person that you are right now. And respect that and love that and know that that's part of a spiritual practice, because you are a transformative person. You are you could say you're a spiritual being, and think of the idea of spirit. Spirit is breath. It's the Latin is breath. Breath is not concrete. Breath is gossamer and ephemeral and fluid, So when we talk about spirituality, it's not a rock. It's not a rigid pole in the ground or any of these other metaphors. It is a fluid and dynamic system that should have the ability, like a river, to flow, and rivers follow a topology. They follow the attractor states, and we do too. We follow, and that's a whole nother can of worms I could open up, is attractor states and
Yeah.
all these other wacky ideas. But it speaks, so in other words, to get really crazy, the universe is speaking a language. We speak our human language, but the universe speaks a language too. And if we just open up to a kind of the flexibility and the fluidity of what the physical universe is doing and what other things might be doing, to me, it only stands to improve a person's relationship with life, reality, and other persons, and maybe what we may not have immediate access to. And to me, that's the transformative spiritual practice that I seek, is just to be an evolving person. And if we were to add some wonderful, like, hippie kind of superlatives, that it's about love, it's about, it is. And that's what I was saying earlier, like, to make oneself vulnerable to know another or to know something new. You have to be vulnerable to let go of what you think is true, to open up that space. And again, I don't even get into truth, but it's just to true means to be a definition of true means to be in faith with something. There's truth, like in the judicial system, but there's also true. I'm true to you, Philip, in this conversation. I'm showing up in good faith to have this. That's what I mean by true. I'm being true to you and not deceiving you, not BSing you, any of that kind of thing. Is that I want to just express something sincerely and share it with you and be vulnerable, because like you said, people could get triggered and say, he's what the hell is he know? So that's vulnerability. So anyway,
Uh, Justin, it was very nice
yeah.
to use a very wrong term for your elaborate speech. And especially in the sense that if I knew that you're an old Greek fan, we would have spent this hour talking about Socrates and
Mm.
all my friends sitting with a light in a barrel and asking if there's
Yeah.
somebody out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I love them. I
Uh,
love them all. Yeah.
I'm the biggest fan.
Yeah.
And we would have talked about the polis and we would have talked about
Hmm.
so many wonderful things. And I've happily thrown this podcast away just to spend an
Uh,
hour talk about the policy. So
yeah.
it
Those
lightens my
those are
heart.
those are psychotechnologies that stay with us to this day. That's, to me, is spiritual. We have people that have been
Yes,
dead for 2,500 years, and they're still speaking
yes,
to us. Hello.
so much, so
Yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah. They're
My
there.
heart is absolutely there. And I think that the audience had also a wonderful example how a podcast could be
Oh,
full of
I
knowledge, science, and wisdom. Or listening to me, where I invite on the 24th of December a world renowned professor to talk about Chris Kringle of all
oh my gosh.
things.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it.
So there we are. This is the wonderful thing about podcasting. You can choose your tablet, you can choose the blue or the red pill
Yeah,
any day of the
yeah. Or the
Justin.
clear pill. No colors.
Thank you.
Philip, thank you
Thank
for
you.
the space. Thank you for sharing with me. And to the audience, if there's anybody still listening, thank you. And if you have any questions, you can always or if you wanna yell at me, I love a good argument. So if you wanna yell at me, go ahead. I would invite that. I would show up in good faith and in love, but I'm willing to have a productive conversation with anybody. But yeah, anyway. But yeah, if you want, Philip will have information if you wanna reach out. I'm available. So,
Thank you so very much, Justin. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
yes, thank you, Philip. I appreciate it.